It was just past midnight when the phone rang in Dr. Samuel Hayes's clinic. A sense of urgency filled the air as he quickly reached for the receiver. On the other end of the line was Jacob Turner, a well-known horse breeder who had been in the business for over 20 years. His voice was trembling, a rare sign of panic from a man who had seen his fair share of births. "Doc, it's Bella. She's in trouble." Jacob's voice was shaky. "She's been struggling for hours, but the foal's not coming. Something's wrong, I can feel it. You need to get here now." Dr. Hayes didn't hesitate. As a veterinarian with decades of experience, he had been called to help with countless difficult births, but Jacob's tone suggested something more serious. Bella, the mare in question, was one of Jacob's most reliable broodmares. He'd never experienced complications with her before. With his heart racing, Dr. Hayes grabbed his jacket and keys, rushing out of the clinic. He had been prepared for a long, grueling night. After all, difficult births were part of the job, but something about the urgency in Jacob's voice made him feel as if this night would be unlike any other. The drive to Turner's ranch felt longer than it actually was, each minute stretching into what felt like an eternity. The moon hung high in the sky, casting an eerie glow on the empty road. Dr. Hayes could hear his own thoughts racing as the headlights illuminated the farm's familiar landscape. What could be causing the mare's distress? Was the foal in danger? And why was Jacob so frantic? When he finally arrived at the ranch, the stillness of the farm struck him. The barn was dimly lit, and Jacob stood at the entrance, his face pale and strained. Without a word, he led Dr. Hayes into the barn, where Bella was lying on the straw, her breathing heavy and labored. The mare's legs trembled as she fought to push, but it was clear that something wasn't right. "She's been at it for hours, Doc. I've never seen her like this," Jacob whispered, stepping back as Dr. Hayes approached. The vet bent over the mare, feeling for the foal, his mind racing with possibilities. But even before he touched her, he knew something was off. This birth was going to be different, and whatever lay ahead, Dr. Hayes could sense that it would challenge everything he knew about animal births. Dr. Hayes moved swiftly, his experienced hands working to assess Bella's condition. He could hear her shallow breaths, a stark contrast to the typical rhythm of a mare in labor. The dim light from the barn's lanterns flickered, casting long shadows across the straw-covered floor. Bella's legs quivered with each contraction, and the strain on her face was evident. Dr. Hayes knelt beside her, trying to comfort the mare with soft words. But his mind was already focused on what might be going wrong. Jacob stood at a distance, his eyes wide with fear, unwilling to step closer. He knew that Dr. Hayes had seen it all: difficult births, complicated deliveries, and even stillborn foals. But there was something unsettling in the air tonight, something that felt different. Dr. Hayes, however, was determined to stay calm and assess the situation. He carefully positioned his hands, preparing to examine the foal's position. As he reached for the unborn baby, something immediately struck him as odd. The foal seemed larger than expected, and its movements didn't feel like the usual rhythmic kicks and shifts of a healthy foal in the womb. His brow furrowed as he adjusted his position to feel the foal more clearly. It wasn't just the size. This foal felt heavier than it should for a mare of Bella's build. Dr. Hayes could feel the hard mass of its body, as if it were packed into a smaller space than it should have been. There was an unnatural rigidity to its form, and the positioning of its head seemed awkward. Foals typically move around in the womb, turning and shifting, but this one was still, almost stiff. His instincts told him that something wasn't right. As he tried to adjust the foal's position, Bella let out a soft whine of distress, and Dr. Hayes noted how unusually quiet she was. Normally, a mare would give out low whinnies and snorts of discomfort, but Bella's silence only deepened his growing unease. He moved gently but quickly, his experienced hands searching for the foal's hooves, but he could not quite place the sensation. The hooves didn't feel quite like they should. They were positioned differently, too far back, too tightly packed within her womb. It felt as though the foal was lodged in a way that wasn't natural for a normal birth. He stepped back, rubbing his eyes in disbelief. This wasn't the usual complication of a breech birth or a stuck foal. Something far stranger was happening here. Dr. Hayes stood up, his mind racing. Whatever was inside Bella wasn't just large or misplaced. It felt like it didn't belong at all. He had to act fast. There was no time for second guesses. He needed to assist Bella in delivering this foal, no matter how strange it might be. Dr. Hayes worked carefully, his hands steady despite the growing tension in the barn. Bella let out a deep, exhausted sigh as another contraction rippled through her body. The foal was almost here. Sweat glistened on Jacob Turner's forehead as he watched in silence, his fingers gripping the wooden stall door so tightly his knuckles turned white. The ranch hands had fallen completely quiet, their usual murmurs of encouragement replaced by an eerie stillness, as if they too sensed something unnatural about this birth. Then, with one final push, the foal slid into the world. For a brief moment, no one spoke. The only sound was Bella's heavy breathing as she lay still, her body trembling from exhaustion. Dr. Hayes immediately leaned in to clear the foal's airways, but as soon as he laid eyes on it, his breath caught in his throat. His entire body tensed. Something was terribly wrong. The foal's coat shimmered under the dim barn lights, not with the damp sheen of a newborn, but with an unnatural, almost metallic glow. It was as if its skin was woven with strands of silver, reflecting the light in an eerie, otherworldly way. Dr. Hayes had never seen anything like it. It wasn't just the color, it was the texture. The foal's fur didn't feel like normal, soft horsehair. It was too smooth, almost too perfect. Jacob took a hesitant step closer. "Doc, what is that?" Dr. Hayes didn't answer. He was too focused on the foal's long, spindly legs, which seemed too tall for its small body. Most newborn foals were wobbly, struggling to stand for the first time, but these legs were different. They bent at unnatural angles, almost too gracefully, too deliberately. The foal wasn't struggling, it was simply waiting. And then it opened its eyes. A shudder ran through Dr. Hayes as he met the foal's gaze. Its eyes were large, too large, and filled with an intelligence that sent a chill down his spine. They weren't the dark, unfocused eyes of a newborn adjusting to the world. No, these eyes were sharp, piercing, and aware. The foal blinked slowly, studying him. It wasn't afraid. It wasn't confused. It wasn't weak. It knew. A strange, unsettling feeling spread through the barn. Bella, instead of licking her newborn like most mares did, remained still, staring at it with wide, uncertain eyes. She seemed hesitant, almost as if she didn't recognize her own offspring. The other horses in the barn shifted nervously in their stalls, snorting and stomping their hooves as if sensing something unnatural had entered their space. Then, in a motion far too fluid for a newborn, the foal moved. It didn't struggle to lift its head, didn't fumble as most foals would. Instead, it stretched its long legs with eerie precision, placing its hooves on the straw-covered ground. And then, as if it had been walking its entire life, it stood. Jacob took another step back, muttering under his breath. "That ain't right, Doc. That ain't right at all." Dr. Hayes couldn't look away. He had helped birth hundreds of foals in his career, but this was something else entirely. Whatever had just been born in that barn was not an ordinary horse, and deep down, he feared they had just witnessed something they were never meant to see. The silence in the barn was suffocating. Every ranch hand, every breath, every creak of the wooden beams overhead seemed frozen in time as the newborn foal stood, impossibly steady, impossibly strong. Dr. Hayes had seen hundreds of foals struggle to find their footing, their wobbly legs shaking under their own weight as they clumsily learned how to balance. But this foal was different. It didn't struggle. It didn't fumble. It rose with a slow, deliberate grace, as if standing was something it had always known how to do. Jacob Turner took an uneasy step back, swallowing hard. "Foals ain't supposed to do that, Doc." His voice was barely above a whisper. Dr. Hayes couldn't respond. His pulse was pounding in his ears as he watched the foal take its first steps, not the unsteady, uncertain ones of a newborn, but smooth, calculated movements. Its unnaturally long legs bent and flexed with eerie precision, like they had been built for something more than simply running in a pasture. Then the foal lifted its head, and that was when the true unease set in. Its piercing eyes, larger than normal, scanned the room with an awareness that sent a chill through Dr. Hayes's spine. This wasn't the confused, blurry gaze of a newborn trying to make sense of the world. It wasn't the wide-eyed innocence of a foal learning who its mother was. No, this was something else entirely. The foal's gaze locked onto each person in the barn, as if studying them, evaluating them. It moved its head with slow, measured turns, taking in the faces of the ranch hands, the flickering lantern light, the dust hanging in the air. And then it settled on Dr. Hayes. A strange, unsettling sensation crept over him. It wasn't fear exactly, but something deeper, something primal. For a fleeting moment, he had the disturbing thought that he was the one being examined, not the other way around. Bella, the mare, let out a quiet, uncertain snort, shifting uneasily as she looked at her own offspring. Normally, a mother would nuzzle her foal, encourage it, reassure it. But Bella hesitated. Her ears flicked back and forth, torn between instinct and uncertainty. The other horses in the barn reacted too. One let out a nervous whinny, stomping its hoof against the dirt. Another, further down, snorted and turned away, as if sensing something unnatural. Jacob ran a shaky hand through his hair. "Doc, what the hell is this thing?" Dr. Hayes couldn't answer. He had spent years studying horses, learning their behavior, their patterns, their instincts, but nothing in his experience could explain what he was seeing now. The foal took another step forward, its hooves barely making a sound against the straw-covered floor. It wasn't just moving, it was approaching, purposefully. And for the first time in his long career, standing in that dimly lit barn with the air thick with something unspoken, Dr. Hayes felt truly out of his depth. Because whatever had just been born that night wasn't normal, and it wasn't just watching them. It understood. A low rumble of thunder echoed across the darkened sky, rolling through the open barn doors like a distant warning. The storm was still far away, but its presence was undeniable, a slow-building force creeping closer with each passing moment. Dr. Hayes barely noticed it at first. His attention was still locked onto the foal standing before him. The unnatural silence that had settled over the barn made the distant thunder feel even more ominous. The foal hadn't reacted to the sound at all. Most newborns would have flinched, startled by the deep vibrations, their instincts driving them toward their mother for comfort. But not this one. It just stood there, still as stone, its piercing gaze locked onto Dr. Hayes, watching, waiting. Jacob Turner shifted uneasily beside him, rubbing his hands together as if trying to shake off an unseen chill. His weathered face was lined with concern, but behind that concern was something deeper, something that looked an awful lot like fear. "Doc," he murmured, keeping his voice low as if afraid the foal could understand him. "I don't like this." Dr. Hayes swallowed hard. He didn't like it either. He turned his gaze back to Bella, the mare, who still hadn't moved to nuzzle her newborn. Instead, she stood frozen, ears flicking nervously, her large dark eyes darting between her foal and the humans in the room. Normally, a mother would be overcome with instinct, licking, nudging, encouraging her baby to nurse. But Bella hesitated. It was almost as if she didn't recognize her own offspring. The other horses in the barn sensed it too. A gelding in the next stall let out a sharp snort, pacing in agitation. Another mare stomped her hoof against the wooden floor, nostrils flaring. They weren't reacting to the storm outside. They were reacting to something inside. The foal. Dr. Hayes exhaled slowly, trying to steady his nerves. Science, he reminded himself. He was a veterinarian. There had to be a logical explanation for what he was seeing. And yet, that metallic sheen to the foal's coat, the way its limbs moved with unnatural grace, those intelligent, unsettling eyes that seemed to hold far more knowledge than they should. None of it made sense. Another low roll of thunder vibrated through the ground, closer this time. The horses grew even more restless, their unease mounting. The barn lanterns flickered slightly, their flames trembling as if responding to some unseen force. Jacob shifted again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Doc, this ain't just some strange foal, is it?" Dr. Hayes didn't answer. He wasn't sure he could, because deep down he felt it too. Whatever had been born in that barn tonight was no ordinary animal. It was something more, something unnatural. And as another crash of thunder roared across the sky, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning.